one of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. They realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted.
On November the 17th, 1957, sheriffs in Plainfield, Wisconsin entered the home of local farmer Ed Gein, the man who would come to be known as the Butcher of Plainfield.
There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh, human skin masks that were hanging from the wall of his bedroom, the faces of women that had been flayed from the skulls, that had been hung on the walls as decorations.
Hi, I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut, and this week we're with author and Gein expert Harold Schechter for an uncut Halloween special all about the nightmarish killer. How did the Gein family end up in Plainfield?
The Gein family moved to Plainfield from La Crosse, Wisconsin, partly because the mother of the family, the matriarch, Augusta, had decided that La Crosse was a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah-like hellhole, and she didn't want her children to be corrupted by all the immoral influences of the big city. Needless to say, La Crosse was not a particularly big city, but they moved to a remote farmhouse about 6 miles west of, you wouldn't necessarily say downtown Plainfield because there was no uptown Plainfield. But anyway, they moved to, I think it was a 95-acre farm, fairly substantial farmstead. The house was, a neat, tidy property. And there, the Geins lived in a great deal of isolation from the rest of the community. And the household consisted of the mother, Augusta, her husband, George, who was something of a ne'er-do-well, an alcoholic, and the 2 sons, Henry and Ed. Plainfield was a very remote, isolated, featureless little village. A state guidebook at the time described it as totally nondescript. The population was very small, never more in its history, I think, than 700 or 800 people. Probably the entire population of the village could have fit into a New York City apartment building. It's what used to be called a one-horse town. I mean, even the natives would joke that they didn't have to worry about kids hanging out on street corners because there were no street corners. And its population largely consisted of, farmers struggling to eke out a living under very harsh circumstances.
What do you know about Gein's childhood?
The dominant influence throughout Gein's life appeared to have been his mother, who kept him very tightly tied, really to the point of strangulation, to her apron strings, and who was consistently warning him about the perils of the outside world, particularly the moral perils of the outside world, and especially as those were embodied in the flesh of other women. Gein seemed to have been very friendless. Whenever he would make some kind of friend, on those rare occasions when he would try to make a school friend and bring home a school friend, the mother would immediately find some reason to disapprove of the other child and forbid Ed from ever bringing him home. So he grew up again in a state of complete social isolation. The father, George, was an alcoholic, and again, from what little is known about him, he appeared to have been somewhat free in his use of physical punishment. The picture that emerges of George from the little available evidence is of, kind of a hapless individual who was, as all 3 male members of the family were, under the thumb of his wife, and again, who was regarded as much as anything else as a sort of obstacle or impediment to the household. When he died, there's no indication that any member of the family, was particularly bereaved to see him go. Ed's older brother, Henry, seemed to have freed himself a little more emotionally and psychologically from Augusta's dominance, and even apparently on a couple of occasions, expressed some criticism of their mother and the hold she was exerting over both of them. So, Ed, who, at least on a conscious level, worshipped his mother and saw her as a kind of goddess who could do no wrong, appears to have been both a little shocked that Henry would find any cause to criticize Augusta, and possibly built up some kind of animosity toward Henry for that attitude.
What happened to Henry?
Well, Henry died under very mysterious circumstances. There was a fire on the property, and again, the cause of the fire is unknown. Nobody knows whether it was a brush fire that was started accidentally, or, sometimes the farmers would start these controlled fires in order to burn off some of the underbrush. But in any case, Ed and Henry were out there trying to put out the fire, and they got separated, and Ed could not locate Henry, and he went and got help. But then after getting this help, he led the other people directly to where Henry's body lay. And there were some mysterious bruises on Henry's head. Anyway, the official verdict of the medical examiner was that Henry had died of a heart attack while fighting this fire, and had injured his head when he fell and hit a rock. But afterwards, when Gein's crimes were uncovered, there was a lot of talk that perhaps Henry had been a victim of Ed's, that Ed in fact had killed Henry partly because of Henry's criticism of Augusta. So with George dead, Henry dead, Ed now found himself living again in this remote, isolated, completely shut-off world with his mother. Evidence seems to suggest that with the other two men out of the way, Ed sort of reveled in having his mommy alone to himself.
What happened to Augusta?
The story that Ed told was that he and Augusta had gone in a wagon to a neighboring farm in order to acquire some hay, I believe. And when they got there, the owner of the farm was out there beating a puppy to death, was whipping this puppy ferociously. And the owner's common-law wife, to whom he apparently was not legally wed, suddenly ran out onto the porch of the farm and started shrieking at the man to stop beating the puppy. And the man didn't listen to her and continued until the puppy was dead. Anyway, Augusta supposedly was so horrified by this scene that she suffered the stroke. However, what was interesting is what horrified Augusta wasn't the sadistic act of this guy beating this puppy to death. It was the sight of this woman to whom he was not legally married, because this so outraged, her pathologically puritanical sense of sexual morality, that it was the sight of this whore suddenly appearing, that caused her to have this episode. So she suffered a stroke. Ed he nursed her very, very diligently, even apparently would get into bed with her on occasion and stroke her and comfort her. And then she seemed to recover, but then she suffered another, this time fatal stroke.
How did Gein cope with Augusta's death?
Well, the death of his mother left him completely isolated, living in this increasingly ramshackle, dilapidated farmhouse that he ceased to take care of whatsoever. It just became this bizarre, grotesque cave of madness that he was living in. And of course he missed her desperately. Augusta was his only real human contact. He seemed to have, a fairly warm and friendly relationship to children, a function, again, of his own stunted personality and emotional development. I think neighbors saw him as an odd, very meek, somewhat simple-minded person, but one who was always willing to pitch in when some farm work needed to be done or some chore needed to be run for them. But they, of course, had no sense of the life that he was pursuing, inside, that incredibly creepy, dismal world of his own farm. So it was at that point, that Gein embarked on these various outrages that would ultimately make him this notorious figure in American crime.
How did Gein's behaviour change?
Well, according to Ed, his grave robbing took place between 1947 and 1952. During that 5-year period, he would make these midnight forays to the local graveyard. He would often follow the local newspapers and read the obituaries. And when some woman middle-aged or elderly woman, who bore some vague resemblance to his departed mother, died and was buried, he would apparently go out to the cemetery at night while the ground, the soil was still fresh and easily dug up, and exhume these coffins and remove the bodies, and sometimes take the entire corpse back to his farmhouse. Sometimes just take parts of the corpse back to the farmhouse and leave the rest there. There's some indication that he initially tried to exhume his mother's corpse. Apparently Ed missed the presence of his mother so much. He wanted to bring her back and somehow, in his madness, reconstitute her in his household. He couldn't get to his mother's grave because the soil in that part of Wisconsin is very sandy. And many coffins are buried within concrete vaults to prevent the sand from collapsing on them. And that was apparently true of Augusta Gein. There's some indication that he dug up graves kind of in a semicircle around Augusta's grave.
How did Gein's crimes escalate?
November 16th, 1957 was the first day of deer hunting season that year. And it was a day when basically the entire male population of the town would have been out in the woods hunting deer, as Ed knew. Ed drove into town to the Worden hardware store. The Worden hardware store was owned by a woman, I believe she was around 57 years old, named Bernice Worden, and her son Frank. Frank, of course, was out in the woods with all the other men. Ed had kind of been hanging around the store for a couple of weeks previously. He had developed something of an obsession with Bernice Worden, again, another one of these local women who vaguely reminded him, because of her stature and appearance, of his mother. Ed came in, asked to buy a half a gallon of antifreeze, which Bernice Worden poured out for him and wrote out a receipt. He went back out to his truck, then came back inside and asked her to see a rifle that was in the window. Ed had brought along some cartridges. He loaded up the rifle. When Bernice Worden turned her back to him, he shot her in the back of the head and then loaded her corpse in his truck and drove back to his farm. Later that day, Frank Worden returned from the woods and found the store empty. His mother wasn't there. He was very, very perplexed by that. And then he saw a trail of blood across the floor of the hardware store, and immediately not only realized, that some foul play had occurred, but immediately suspected Ed Gein, because Gein had been kind of bothering his mother for the past few weeks. So one set of lawmen went out in search of Gein. They found him having dinner at a neighbor's house, and they arrested him. And then another set of lawmen went out to Gein's farmhouse, and that's where they made these discoveries that really sent shockwaves around the world.
But before we get to Gein's House of Horrors, please do give this video a thumbs up and drop us a comment below. Join our Patreon and come chat about Ed Gein or any of our other videos on our Discord. The links for both are on the screen now. What horrors were uncovered at Gein's farm?
Two of the lawmen first entered into, they couldn't get into the house, so they went around back and entered into what was called the summer kitchen, which was a little shed outside where different things would be stored. And it was very dark in there, and one of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. Although it didn't look like a deer, they realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted. The carcass was open, hollowed out, the entrails were missing, and it was headless. And they realized they had found the body of Bernice Worden. And of course, both of them just stumbled out in horror and vomited, at the sight of this thing. Other authorities were summoned, and a search of Gein's farmhouse was conducted. Ed Gein's farmhouse, it was a madhouse. First of all, Ed was what we now would call a hoarder. It was as though he had reversed the normal process of trash disposal, and instead of taking all his garbage to the dump, would go to the dump and bring it into his house. It was just this incredible chaos of trash and garbage. He would save every bit of chewing gum that he'd ever chewed. There were rotting old mattresses and broken radios and, whatever kind of trash and junk you can imagine. But amid all that wreckage, they discovered these incomprehensible, unspeakably awful objects that had been fashioned out of human body parts. There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh. There were soup bowls made from the tops of human skulls. There was a jar containing human noses. There was a box full of female genitalia, some of which had been painted and tied with ribbons. There was a belt fashioned out of female nipples. Among the most hideous of all the items were human skin masks that were hanging from the wall of his bedroom, the faces of women that had been flayed from the skulls and that had been preserved. Some of them had lipstick applied to them and that had been hung on the walls as decorations. It became clear that Ed Gein's farmhouse was the habitation of a literal ghoul, somebody who had been living amidst these horrific relics, of human dismemberment. And then, most notoriously, there was a skin suit that Ed had crafted out of the upper torso of a woman and the leggings of a woman. And apparently, as he later confessed, he would put on this skin suit and put on one of the female skin masks and caper around in his yard, pretending to be his mother. I think he was both trying to rebuild his mother, but I also think that he was taking revenge on his mother. Obviously, on all of us, there's a certain amount of ambivalence to our parents. In Ed's case, because of the extremely pathological conditions under which he was raised, these were magnified to the nth degree. So that kind of love and hate of mommy were manifested both by his attempting to bring her back from the dead, but also perpetrating, these atrocities on the corpses of female bodies. Plainfield was suddenly famous for the most horrifying of reasons, that it was the home of America's most notorious psychopath.
How did investigators link Gein to the 1954 disappearance of Mary Hogan?
There had been a female tavern keeper named Mary Hogan who ran this roadside tavern outside of Plainfield, who had disappeared very, very mysteriously. They found gun shells in her tavern, and again, this trail of blood that indicated she had been dragged out from the tavern. Gein would sometimes make people would take as these sort of sick jokes that she was down at his house. But in searching through Gein's House of Horrors, as it was known by then, the investigators opened up some receptacle and saw this face and pulled it out and realized it was Mary Hogan's, that she had been another one of these victims.
What happened when police interrogated Gein?
He was subjected to a very lengthy interrogation. There are other disappearances in Wisconsin at the time. He was suspected of having perpetrated the abduction murder of a young woman who had been snatched from the house she was babysitting at, and several others, but there's no indication that Gein was responsible for those crimes. But yeah, he freely confessed to the murders of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. And of course, when Gein's, when the police first broke into Gein's house and discovered this crazy mass of body parts, their first assumption was Gein was a serial killer. It was only during his interrogation that he revealed that they were taken from the corpses he had dug up from the local cemeteries. And people, in a way, had a harder time believing that than that he was a serial killer. That seemed like totally beyond the bounds of belief for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, nobody believed that he wouldn't have been noticed, going out to the cemetery all these times and digging up corpses. So they actually went and exhumed a bunch of these graves that Gein said he had desecrated. And in fact, when they uncovered them, they discovered that the coffins had been broken into and the bodies were missing, or, there were just parts of the skeleton remaining there.
Why was Gein digging up bodies?
Gein wasn't about, as many serial killers are, dominating and torturing women and taking perverse sexual pleasure from seeing their suffering. The two women he killed, he killed execution style. He was interested he was interested in doing things to their corpses. We think of Gein as this notorious American serial murderer, but in many ways he doesn't really fit that profile. Gein was a necrophile, essentially. He was mostly preying on the dead, really, and in the case of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, I think various things were going on there. With Mary Hogan, too, I think there was some sense in which he associated her with his mother. She almost seemed to be like the shadow side of his mother. And I think in killing her, again, he was both enacting some kind of homicidal rage toward his mother, but I think also there were times when he just ran out of suitable female corpses and had to make his own.
What happened to Gein after his secrets were unearthed?
Well, initially, Gein was just put in a mental institution, and then I believe about 10 years later, really, he petitioned for a trial. He was hoping to, Gein, by the way, during his entire period of incarceration, which lasted from his arrest in 1957 until his death a couple of decades later, was a completely model inmate, who showed no signs at all of violent tendencies. In fact, he was probably living a better life then than he had ever lived in the misery of his farmstead. But when he was tried, the Wisconsin judicial system had this kind of strange bifurcated trial system where he was tried, but then also there was a sanity hearing. So he was tried and found guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden, but then he was judged insane and stuck back in the mental institution.
What's the truth about Gein's mental health?
There's some indication that Ed was in fact schizophrenic. Of course, it's important to realize people have a misconception of what schizophrenia means. Some people think it means to have a split personality, which of course is a completely different psychological phenomenon. There are indications that Ed was, clinically psychotic, that he had hallucinations, that he heard voices, that he would have olfactory delusions. He would smell weird things that weren't there, rotting flesh and so on. There were times when he was smelling actual rotting flesh, but other times he might just be walking in a field and, or the trees would start talking to him. Most serial murderers are not psychotic, but Ed seemed to have the symptoms of some form of psychosis. There's a big difference between a psychopath and somebody who is psychotic. Psychopaths are very rational beings. They put their rationality to very malevolent uses, but they do know the difference between right and wrong. I'm not sure he did recognize that what he was doing was wrong. There are some necrophiles who think, well, I wasn't really hurting anybody. They were dead anyway.
What was the impact of Gein's crimes on the residents of Plainfield?
One thing they did very early on was burn down Gein's farmhouse because they recognized that this was going to become some kind of grotesque tourist attraction if they didn't. They were very traumatized for a whole variety of ways. Many of the families, the graves of their loved ones had been horribly desecrated and violated by Gein. Then, of course, they were getting all this unwanted attention as the home of this monster. People are always asking, well, how could you not have known that these horrors were taking place right in your midst over the course of a dozen years, especially in a town of like 700 people or whatever? There have always been people in Plainfield who have wanted no association at all with the Ed Gein crimes. That's an increasingly losing battle, because Gein, of course, has become such an infamous figure that there's, all these morbid tourists, who want to go visit his grave and so on and so forth.
What is Gein's legacy?
At the time the Gein crimes were being revealed in the press, there was a writer of pulp horror named Robert Bloch, and he was following the Gein case very, very, very closely in the newspapers. And at some point, when Gein was being interviewed by various psychiatrists, all these headlines in the papers were trumpeting the fact that Gein had been motivated by these deranged Oedipal conflicts, that he was this desperately sick mama's boy, who was perpetrating these atrocities on middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. And this caught the attention of Robert Bloch, who decided this could potentially make the basis of a good horror novel, and that became the book Psycho. What's interesting about Psycho is it was really the first movie, first American horror movie in which the monster was this very, very typically American kind of figure. If you look at horror movies before then, there were all these Eastern European monsters, Frankenstein and Dracula and the Wolfman, or else they were aliens from outer space. With Psycho establishes, and, Ed Gein establishes the ordinary middle American guy who turns out to be this monster in disguise. So there's a sense in which, Ed Gein is really the grandfather of all modern horror.
In July 1984, 77-year-old Ed Gein, senile and suffering from cancer, died of respiratory failure at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. He was laid to rest next to his mother at the Plainfield Cemetery. In a strange irony, Gein's headstone was robbed from his grave. All that remains now is a ghostly space amongst the Gein family plot. We'll be bringing you another video on Ed Gein next Tuesday, so please do subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss out. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up below and make sure you click that hype button. I'm Nick from True Crime Uncut. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.